The sheriff's hand was steady as he held out the eviction notice, but I could see the confusion in Melissa's eyes as she stared at the official document bearing her own signature. The signature she'd scrawled so carelessly just 6 months ago when I'd told her it was just another property tax form. What she didn't know then, what none of them knew, was that she'd just signed away her right to live in the house she'd lorded over for 37 years. I suppose I should explain how we got here, though it feels strange to think of myself as someone with a story worth telling. For most of my 62 years, I've been background music in other people's symphonies, the reliable bass note that keeps everything steady while others take the spotlight. My name is Eleanor, though Melissa has called me that woman for so long that sometimes I wonder if she's forgotten I have a name at all. I met David when I was 24, fresh out of business school with dreams bigger than my bank account and a work ethic that could power a small city. He was 26, sweet, and completely under his mother's thumb, though I was too young and too in love to see it clearly then. Melissa made her position known from our very first meeting. I was a temporary inconvenience, a phase her precious son would outgrow once he came to his senses. She never did approve of our marriage, and she made sure I knew it in 1,000 small ways. The wedding invitations that mysteriously didn't reach certain family members, the seating chart that placed me at the children's table during the rehearsal dinner, the toast she gave that mentioned how proud she was of David for finally settling down, with just enough emphasis on finally to make it clear she thought he was settling in more ways than one. But I was determined to prove her wrong, to show her that I was worthy of her son, worthy of the family name. I threw myself into being the perfect daughter-in-law with the same intensity I'd once reserved for corporate presentations. I cooked her favorite meals, remembered her birthday when David forgot, drove her to doctor's appointments, and listened to the same stories about David's childhood achievements over and over again, nodding and smiling like I was hearing them for the first time. The house became the center of our universe, as it had always been the center of hers. It was a beautiful Victorian on Maple Street, built in 1923. With original hardwood floors and crown molding that spoke of better times. Melissa had inherited it from her mother, who'd inherited it from hers, and she wore that legacy like a crown. She'd moved in when David's father died, ostensibly to help with the mortgage, but somehow she'd never left. The arrangement made sense at first. The house was huge, we were newlyweds with student loans, and Melissa was lonely. What I didn't understand then was that in Melissa's mind, there was only room for one woman in that house, and it wasn't me. The early years weren't openly hostile, just persistently uncomfortable. She'd rearrange the kitchen after I cooked, moving everything back to where it belonged. She'd correct my pronunciation of family names, as if I were a foreign student still learning the language. When we had guests, she'd introduce me as David's wife, Eleanor, with a slight pause before my name as if she needed a moment to remember it. I told myself it would get better when we had children. Melissa would soften, I thought, become the doting grandmother I'd always wished I'd had. But the children never came. After 3 miscarriages and 2 failed IVF attempts, that particular dream died a quiet death, taking with it my last hope of earning Melissa's acceptance through biology. Instead, the absence of grandchildren seemed to confirm her suspicions about me. I caught her once, talking to her sister on the phone, saying, "Well, you know how career women are. They wait too long and then their bodies just won't cooperate. Poor David." As if my infertility was a personal failing, a punishment for having the audacity to want more than motherhood. The years blurred together in a haze of small humiliations and smaller victories. I built my consulting business from our converted garage, working 18-hour days to prove myself in a field dominated by men who thought strategic planning was something women did for dinner parties. Melissa would interrupt my client calls to ask where I'd put the good silver, or whether I thought the guest bathroom needed new towels, always with perfect timing to make me sound unprofessional. But the business grew despite her interference, or maybe because of it. There's something about having to fight for every inch of respect at home that makes corporate battles feel manageable by comparison. By my 40th birthday, I was running a firm with 15 employees and a client roster that included some of the biggest names in the region. David was proud in his quiet way, but Melissa's response was to ask when I planned to slow down and focus on what really matters. What really mattered, in her view, was maintaining the house and managing the social obligations that came with being a family of standing in our small city. I became the de facto event coordinator for every holiday, birthday, anniversary, and family crisis. When David's aunt needed someone to organize the funeral arrangements, guess who got volunteered? When his cousin's daughter needed a baby shower, somehow that fell to me too. Every family milestone became another opportunity for Melissa to showcase her authority while I did the actual work. The financial arrangement in the house was never clearly defined, which should have been my first warning. David and I paid the mortgage, utilities, insurance, and maintenance costs, while Melissa contributed what she called household management and occasional grocery money. She had her Social Security and a small pension from her late husband's job at the post office, but the real money, the money that kept the lights on and the roof repaired, came from us. I didn't mind it at first. The house was beautiful, and I understood the emotional value it held for David. His childhood memories lived in those rooms, and I wanted to preserve that for him. What I slowly began to understand was that financial contribution didn't translate to domestic authority in Melissa's worldview. I might pay the bills, but she held the keys to the kingdom. It was little things at first. She'd throw away mail addressed to me, claiming it looked like junk. She'd rearrange my home office whenever I traveled for business, boxing up files and putting them in the basement to make the room look more presentable. When I protested, she'd look genuinely confused and say something like, "Oh, dear, I thought you were done with all that," gesturing dismissively at the work that was paying for her comfortable lifestyle. The guest list for dinner parties became a particular battleground. Melissa would invite couples from the neighborhood, old friends of hers, people from her church group, and somehow forget to mention it until the day of the event. Then she'd casually suggest that I might want to whip up something nice for everyone, as if feeding 12 people on 4 hours' notice was a reasonable request. I learned to keep emergency ingredients on hand, the makings for her famous beef stroganoff, ingredients for her mother's dinner rolls, wine that paired well with her stories about the good old days. I became expert at stretching conversation, at asking the right questions to keep her guests engaged, at making everyone feel welcome in what was technically my home but functionally hers. The worst part wasn't the extra work or even the lack of appreciation. It was the way she'd position herself as the hostess while relegating me to kitchen duty. She'd hold court in the living room, entertaining guests with family stories and neighborhood gossip, while I spent the evening in the kitchen, emerging only to serve courses and clear plates. When complimented on the food, she'd smile graciously and say something like, "Eleanor is so helpful in the kitchen. I don't know what we'd do without her." Helpful? Like I was staff. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, during what Melissa had announced would be a small family dinner for David's birthday. I'd spent the afternoon preparing his favorite meal, herb-crusted lamb with roasted root vegetables, the same dinner I'd made for his birthday every year for the past 15 years. I'd taken the day off from work, driven to 3 different stores to find the perfect ingredients, and spent hours in the kitchen making sure everything was perfect. The guests began arriving at 6. Melissa's sister Ruth and her husband Frank, David's cousin Patricia and her new boyfriend, some lawyer she'd been seeing for a few months, Melissa's neighbor Joan, who apparently needed cheering up after her recent divorce, and finally Dr. Harrison from Melissa's church group, a retired professor who Melissa had been not so subtly trying to set up with recently divorced Joan. I was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on the lamb when I heard Melissa's voice carrying clearly from the dining room. She was explaining the seating arrangement to her guests, and her words stopped me cold. "Eleanor will be serving tonight, so don't worry about waiting for her to sit down. She prefers to eat in the kitchen anyway, says it's easier to manage everything from there." The casual dismissal in her tone was bad enough, but what followed was worse. "She's really more comfortable in that role, you know. All that business training makes her quite efficient at managing these kinds of events. She's like having professional catering, except it's family." A pause, then a light laugh. "Well, professional help anyway. We're so fortunate to have her." Professional help, not daughter-in-law, not family member, help. I stood there with the carving knife in my hand, listening to the murmurs of agreement from the dining room, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though that was certainly part of it. It was more like a door closing somewhere deep in my chest, the final click of a lock I hadn't realized I'd been trying to pick for 37 years. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see David nodding along with his mother's explanation, not protesting, not correcting her characterization of his wife as domestic staff. He caught my eye for a moment and gave me what he probably thought was an encouraging smile, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother had just relegated me to servant status in my own home. That night, after the dishes were done and the guests had gone home praising Melissa's wonderful hospitality, I sat in my home office and did something I should have done years earlier. I started making phone calls. The first was to Tom Mitchell, a real estate attorney I'd worked with on several business deals. The second was to Brenda Mark, a private investigator who specialized in financial backgrounds. The third was to my accountant, a sharp woman named Diana who'd been handling my business finances for over a decade. What I learned over the next few weeks changed everything. The house, it turned out, wasn't in as stable a financial position as Melissa liked to pretend. David's father had taken out a second mortgage in the early 2000s, during the housing boom, thinking the investment would pay off when they sold. Instead, he died unexpectedly, leaving Melissa with two mortgages on a house whose value had dropped significantly during the recession. She'd been making minimum payments for years, barely keeping her head above water, and the bank was getting restless. More interesting still, she'd missed 3 payments in the past 6 months, apparently hoping that David and I wouldn't notice the foreclosure notices that had been arriving in the mail. The notices she'd been throwing away. The junk mail she'd claimed was cluttering up our mailbox. Sarah's investigation revealed the full scope of Melissa's financial situation. The pension was smaller than she'd led us to believe, and she'd been supplementing her income by charging household expenses to credit cards she'd opened in David's name, using his excellent credit to fund her lifestyle while making minimum payments that barely covered the interest. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd been living beyond her means for years, using her son's credit and his wife's income to maintain the illusion of financial stability while systematically undermining both of their financial futures. But here's where the story gets interesting. Remember that consulting business I'd built from our converted garage? The one Melissa had spent years dismissing as a cute hobby that interfered with my real responsibilities? By 2019, it was generating enough revenue to make me a millionaire several times over. I'd been quietly reinvesting profits, building a portfolio of properties and investments that would ensure my financial independence regardless of what happened to David's credit or Melissa's family home. I could have confronted them with the evidence, could have demanded that Melissa take responsibility for her financial mess and stop sabotaging our credit. I could have insisted that David choose between his mother's comfort and his wife's dignity. I could have packed my bags and started over somewhere else, free from the daily humiliation of being treated like hired help in my own home. Instead, I did something much more strategic. I bought the house. Not from Melissa, who didn't actually own it free and clear, but from the bank, which was more than happy to sell the mortgage to someone with excellent credit and a substantial down payment. The process took 3 months of careful negotiation, during which I continued to play my role as the helpful daughter-in-law, serving dinner parties and managing household crises, while quietly taking legal ownership of the property that had been the source of Melissa's power for 4 decades. The transfer required Melissa's signature on several documents, which Tom Mitchell prepared with the kind of careful language that would make them legally binding while remaining vague enough to avoid suspicion. When I presented them to her as property tax updates and insurance paperwork, she signed without reading, trusting that I was simply handling the boring administrative details that came with homeownership. "You're so good with paperwork, dear," she said, scrawling her signature across the bottom of a document that officially made her a tenant in my house. "I don't know how people managed before computers and all these forms." The final signature, the one that sealed her fate, was on a standard rental agreement disguised as a household maintenance contract. She thought she was agreeing to contribute more toward utilities and repairs. What she was actually doing was acknowledging that she understood her residence in the house was contingent on following certain household rules and could be terminated with proper legal notice. I kept the documents in my safe, along with copies of all the credit card statements, mortgage records, and bank notices that documented her years of financial deception. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. The next family dinner was scheduled for Thanksgiving, and Melissa had outdone herself with the guest list. David's entire extended family would be there, plus several of her friends from church and the new neighbors from down the street whom she was eager to impress. 23 people in total, all expecting a traditional feast served with Melissa's famous hospitality. I spent the week before Thanksgiving preparing with military precision. I ordered the turkey from the best butcher in town, planned a menu that would showcase my culinary skills, and arranged the house to accommodate our largest guest list ever. Melissa fluttered around, supervising my preparations and offering suggestions that were really commands in disguise. "Maybe we should use the good china for everyone, not just the family," she suggested on Tuesday, as I was planning the table settings. "Of course," I replied, mentally calculating how many additional place settings I'd need to buy. "And I think the dining room table will be too small for everyone. We'll need to set up the additional table in the living room," she continued, as if this was a collaborative decision rather than an assignment. "Already planned by I said, showing her the detailed seating chart I'd prepared. "I'll set up the second table tomorrow evening." She looked slightly surprised that I'd anticipated her needs so thoroughly, but pleased with my efficiency. You're so organized, Eleanor. I don't know how you keep track of everything. The backhanded compliment stung less than it used to. In fact, it barely registered at all. I was too focused on the larger picture, on the careful choreography of what was about to unfold. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and drizzly, but the house was warm and filled with the sense of roasting turkey and baking pies. I'd been up since 4 a.m., managing the complex timing of a meal for 23 people, and everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The first guests arrived at noon, David's aunt and uncle from Pittsburgh, along with their 3 adult children and their families. Melissa greeted them at the door with her arms wide, accepting hugs and compliments on how beautiful the house looked. Eleanor has been such a help with the preparations, she told them, gesturing toward the kitchen where I was basting the turkey. She's really got quite a talent for entertaining. More guests arrived in waves, cousins and church friends, neighbors and family. Friends, each group welcomed with Melissa's gracious charm and directed toward the living room where David was managing drinks and appetizers. The house filled with conversation and laughter, the comfortable noise of a family gathering. I moved between kitchen and dining room, managing the complex logistics of serving hot food to 23 people while Melissa held court in the living room, sharing family stories and accepting compliments on the beautiful table setting and delicious smells coming from the kitchen. "Melissa, you've really outdone yourself this year," I heard Mrs. Patterson from church saying. "Everything looks absolutely perfect." "Oh, thank you, dear. I do try to maintain certain standards," Melissa replied, her voice carrying that particular tone of false modesty that meant she was thoroughly pleased with herself. The meal itself was a masterpiece, if I do say so myself. The turkey was perfectly golden and moist, the stuffing seasoned exactly right, the green bean casserole made from scratch rather than the usual canned version. I'd even made 3 different types of pie, ensuring that every guest's preferences were covered. But as I served course after course, I noticed the familiar pattern emerging. Melissa accepted compliments graciously while I remained in the background, refilling glasses and clearing plates. When David's cousin asked about the recipe for the sweet potato casserole, Melissa launched into a detailed explanation of the family recipe that I'd actually found in a cookbook and perfected through years of trial and error. It was during the main course that things took their turn. Dr. Harrison, Melissa's friend from church, was regaling the table with stories about his recent trip to Europe. He'd been to France and Germany, touring castles and museums, and he was particularly enthusiastic about the domestic staff at some of the historic houses he'd visited. "The thing that impressed me most," he was saying, "was how well trained the help was. Completely invisible until you needed something, then appearing like magic with exactly what you required. It's a lost art, really, that kind of professional service." Melissa seized the opening with the skill of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Oh, Dr. Harrison, you'd appreciate Eleanor's approach to these dinner parties," she said, her voice carrying clearly to where I was standing in the kitchen doorway. "She's got it down to a science, really. Knows exactly when to appear and when to disappear. It's like having professional staff, except it's family." She paused, taking a sip of wine, completely unaware that every conversation in the room had quieted to listen to her words. "Well, professional help anyway," she continued with a light laugh. "She's really more comfortable in that role, managing things from behind the scenes. Some people are natural hostesses and others are natural helpers. Eleanor's definitely the latter." The silence that followed wasn't complete. There were still quiet conversations happening at the far end of the table, but I could feel the discomfort radiating from several of the guests. David's Aunt Ruth was staring at her plate with obvious embarrassment. His cousin Patricia had gone very still, her fork halfway to her mouth. David himself was focused intently on cutting his turkey, as if precision in carving could somehow undo what his mother had just said about his wife. But Melissa, either oblivious to the social chill or simply too pleased with her own cleverness to care, pressed on. "I was just telling Joan the other day how fortunate we are to have Eleanor managing all the domestic details. It's such a relief not to have to worry about the kitchen and serving and all that business. I can focus on the actual hosting, the conversation, and making everyone feel welcome. It's really the best division of labor." She looked around the table, smiling expectantly, waiting for someone to agree with her assessment of our household dynamics. When no one immediately responded, she added, "Eleanor's got such a gift for it, really. All that business training makes her wonderfully efficient at managing events. She treats it just like a corporate project." And that's when I decided I'd heard enough. I walked out of the kitchen, still wearing my apron, still holding the serving spoon I'd been using to distribute the cranberry sauce, and took my place at the head of the table, the seat that Melissa had left empty because, as she'd explained to several guests, Eleanor prefers to eat standing up in the kitchen where she can keep an eye on everything. The conversation died completely. 23 faces turned toward me, some curious, some concerned, a few clearly anticipating drama. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent dining room, "but I think there's been some confusion about the dinner arrangements, and I'd like to clarify a few things." Melissa looked startled, then slightly annoyed. "Eleanor, dear, we're in the middle of dinner. Perhaps whatever it is can wait until—" "Actually, it can't wait," I interrupted, settling into my chair with the calm authority I'd learned from years of boardroom presentations. "Because it directly concerns everyone at this table." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each of our guests before continuing. "Melissa has been describing me as a professional help, which is an interesting characterization considering that this is my house." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "I'm sorry," Dr. Harrison said finally, clearly confused. "Your house?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "I bought it from the bank 3 months ago when they were preparing to foreclose on the mortgage that Melissa hasn't been able to keep current." Melissa's face had gone white. "Eleanor, what are you talking about? This is the family home. This is David's inheritance. David's inheritance was 2 mortgages and about $40,000 in credit card debt that you'd accumulated in his name," I said, my voice still perfectly level. "The house was 3 months away from foreclosure when I purchased it to save his credit rating." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded document, a copy of the deed that Tom Mitchell had prepared for exactly this moment. Melissa signed the transfer papers herself, though she may not have read them carefully. They were mixed in with some property tax forms I'd asked her to review. David was staring at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Eleanor, what are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that for the past 3 months, your mother has been a tenant in my house, and as of this morning, she's a tenant who's in violation of her lease agreement." I stood up, still holding the deed, and looked directly at Melissa. "The lease clearly states that tenants will treat the property owner and other residents with respect and courtesy. It also specifies that the property is not to be used for commercial entertaining without the owner's explicit permission." Melissa found her voice at last. "This is ridiculous. Eleanor, you can't be serious. This is the family home. I've lived here for 40 years. "You've lived here as a guest," I corrected. "First as David's father's guest, then as David's guest, and for the past 3 months as my tenant. And frankly, you've been a problematic tenant." I looked around the table again, noting the shocked faces, the uncomfortable fidgeting, the way David's cousin Patricia was trying very hard not to smile. "I've spent 15 years being treated like domestic staff in my own home. I've cooked countless meals for Melissa's guests, cleaned up after parties I wasn't invited to participate in, and smiled politely while being introduced as help rather than family." My voice remained calm, but I could feel the power in it, the authority that came from finally speaking my truth. This morning, I heard Melissa explain to Mrs. Creed from down the street that I was just the help, and that guests shouldn't worry about acknowledging me during dinner because I preferred to eat in the kitchen with the other staff. Several gasps came from around the table. David's Aunt Ruth looked horrified. "That was the final straw," I continued. "So I called my attorney this morning and initiated eviction proceedings." I pulled out another document, the eviction notice that the sheriff would be serving tomorrow morning. "Melissa has 30 days to find alternative housing. The notice will be served officially tomorrow, but I thought it was only fair to give everyone advance warning since this affects holiday plans." The silence stretched out until Dr. Harrison cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps I should leave, ma'am," he said, starting to rise from his chair. "Please stay," I said firmly. "Dinner isn't over, and I'd hate for Melissa's behavior to ruin everyone's Thanksgiving." I sat back down and picked up my fork. "Melissa, you're welcome to finish your meal, but I'd appreciate it if you'd refrain from referring to me as help for the remainder of the evening. It's disrespectful to your hostess." The rest of dinner proceeded in surreal fashion. Melissa sat frozen in her chair, staring at the eviction notice as if it might disappear if she looked at it hard enough. David kept opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again without saying anything. A few guests made awkward attempts at conversation, but most people focused intently on their food. I, meanwhile, felt lighter than I had in years. The lamb was perfectly cooked, the wine was excellent, and for the first time in recent memory, I was actually enjoying a dinner party in my own home. After the guests left, most of them mumbling uncomfortable goodbyes and promising to call soon, David finally found his voice. "Eleanor, we need to talk." Yes, we do, I agreed. But first, your mother and I need to discuss the logistics of her move. Melissa had been silent for the past hour, but now she looked up with something approaching her old imperious manner. You can't be serious about this eviction nonsense. This is David's family home. You can't just throw out family over some silly misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, I said quietly. And it's not silly. You've spent years treating me like an employee in my own home, and I'm done accepting that treatment. But where will I go? She asked, and for the first time I heard genuine fear in her voice. That's not my problem to solve, I replied. You have 30 days to figure it out. I'd suggest starting with David's cousin Patricia. She seemed very interested in the size of her inheritance when we were discussing family finances last Christmas. David finally spoke up. Eleanor, this is my mother. We can't just kick her out. There has to be another solution. I looked at my husband, this man I'd loved for 37 years, who'd watched his mother humiliate me countless times without ever once coming to my defense, and felt something settle into place in my chest. David, your mother has been financially exploiting us for years. She's damaged your credit, spent money we didn't authorize, and consistently treated me like domestic staff rather than your wife. If you want to provide her with housing, you're welcome to find an apartment for both of you. His face went pale. You'd throw me out too? I'd prefer not to, I said honestly. But I'm done living in a house where I'm not treated with basic respect. If you can't understand why your mother's behavior has been unacceptable, then we have bigger problems than housing arrangements. The conversation that followed was long and painful, but ultimately productive. David admitted that he'd been avoiding the situation because confronting his mother felt impossible. He'd grown up walking on eggshells around her moods and opinions, and the pattern had continued into our marriage. Melissa tried several different approaches: tears, anger, guilt, and finally desperate bargaining. She offered to pay rent, to help more with housework, to stop criticizing my cooking. But the time for negotiations had passed. Melissa, I said finally, you've made it clear over the years that you don't see me as family. You've consistently treated me as an employee and not a particularly valued one. I'm simply accepting your assessment and formalizing our relationship accordingly. But I never meant, she started. Yes, you did, I interrupted. You meant every word, every dismissive comment, every time you introduced me as help rather than family. You meant it when you threw away my mail and when you rearranged my office and when you planned dinner parties without consulting me. You've been very clear about what I mean to you. The eviction proceeded exactly as planned. Melissa found a small apartment across town, near the church where she'd spent so many years receiving sympathy for having such an ungrateful daughter-in-law. Several church ladies rallied around her, offering furniture and casseroles and a steady stream of validation for her position as the wronged party in this family drama. David stayed, but our relationship required months of counseling to repair. He had to learn to see his mother's behavior through my eyes, to understand how her constant undermining had damaged not just my self-esteem, but our marriage. It wasn't easy work, but it was necessary. The house, freed from Melissa's constant territorial marking, became a home for the first time. I redecorated the living room in colors I actually liked. I turned Melissa's old bedroom into a proper home office. I started hosting dinner parties where I was the hostess, not the help. Most importantly, I learned to value my own worth independently of other people's opinions. Melissa had spent years trying to convince me that I was lucky to be tolerated, that I should be grateful for the scraps of acceptance she occasionally threw my way. Breaking free from that psychological cage was harder than any legal maneuvering, but infinitely more rewarding. The aftermath revealed just how deep Melissa's deception had run. When we finally got access to all the financial records, we discovered that she'd been intercepting mail for years, hiding not just foreclosure notices but medical bills, credit card statements, and tax documents. She'd opened accounts in David's name, used his social security number to rent furniture and appliances, and had been systematically destroying evidence of her financial mismanagement. The credit repair took 2 years and cost us thousands of dollars in legal fees, but we eventually cleared David's name and restored his credit rating. We also discovered that Melissa had been telling her friends and family that we were financially supporting her out of generosity rather than necessity, portraying herself as the beloved matriarch being cared for by devoted children rather than the financial parasite she'd actually become. The family reactions were mixed. Some relatives understood and supported our decision. Others, particularly those who'd benefited from Melissa's hospitality over the years, were less sympathetic. David's cousin Patricia, the one who'd seemed amused during the Thanksgiving revelation, later admitted that she'd always wondered how we managed such elaborate entertaining on David's teacher salary. I kept thinking Melissa must have had some secret inheritance or something, she told me months later. It never occurred to me that you were funding everything while she took the credit. The church ladies predictably rallied around Melissa and cast me as the heartless daughter-in-law who'd thrown a poor widow out of her family home. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Melissa had crafted quite a story about my ingratitude and selfishness, painting herself as the victim of a calculating woman who'd stolen her home through legal trickery. I didn't bother to correct the narrative. People who wanted to believe Melissa's version weren't people whose opinions mattered to me, and those who knew us well understood the truth without explanation. The business, freed from the constant interruption and subtle sabotage, flourished beyond my wildest expectations. Without Melissa's helpful interruptions during client calls, without her constant criticisms of my priorities, without the energy drain of managing her emotional needs and social obligations, I found myself with mental space I'd forgotten I possessed. Within 2 years, I'd expanded into 2 new markets and hired a partner to help manage the growing client base. The success felt sweeter because it was entirely mine. No one could diminish it by suggesting I was neglecting yet more important duties or dismiss it as a hobby that interfered with real life. David and I found our way back to each other, but it was a different relationship than we'd had before. He had to learn to see me as a separate person with my own needs and boundaries, rather than an extension of his family system. I had to learn to express my needs directly rather than hoping he'd intuit them and defend me. The counseling helped, but the real healing came from daily practice. From David learning to speak up when his mother made disparaging comments about me, from me learning to advocate for myself rather than suffering in martyred silence, from both of us learning to prioritize our marriage over family peace. Melissa never apologized, never acknowledged that her behavior had been problematic, never took responsibility for the financial deception or the years of emotional manipulation. In her version of events, she remained the wronged party, the victim of an ungrateful daughter-in-law who'd forgotten her place. But her opinion stopped mattering to me somewhere along the way. I realized that I'd been seeking approval from someone who was fundamentally incapable of giving it, trying to earn respect from someone who saw respect as a zero-sum game, where acknowledging my worth would somehow diminish her own. The house on Maple Street became a symbol of possibility rather than obligation. I learned to entertain because I enjoyed it, not because it was expected. I invited people I actually liked, served food I wanted to cook, and participated in conversations rather than managing them from the background. 3 years after the eviction, David and I were hosting a small dinner party for some friends from my business network. As I was setting the table, using the good china because I wanted to, not because someone else had decided it was appropriate, David came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "I was just thinking," he said, "about how different this feels from the old days." "Different how?" I asked, though I knew what he meant. "Peaceful," he said. "Like we're actually living our own life instead of performing in someone else's play." That night, as our friends complimented the meal and thanked us for a lovely evening, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all those years. Not Melissa's approval, not acceptance into some exclusive family club, but my own sense of worth and the freedom to live according to my own values. The woman who'd served countless meals while being dismissed as help was gone. In her place was someone who knew her own value and refused to accept less than she deserved. It had taken 62 years and a public humiliation to get there, but the journey had been worth every difficult step. Melissa still lives in her small apartment across town, still surrounded by church ladies who sympathize with her version of events. We exchange Christmas cards and maintain the bare minimum of civil contact required for family functions, but we're no longer pretending that we're anything more than polite strangers. David visits her occasionally, though their relationship has changed too. He no longer feels obligated to absorb her complaints about me or to serve as a mediator between us. When she starts criticizing my decisions or questioning my motives, he changes the subject or leaves. It took him months to develop that backbone, but once he found it, he discovered that their interactions became much more pleasant when he refused to participate in the old dynamics. The most surprising development came 2 years after the eviction, when Melissa suffered a minor heart attack and needed someone to help manage her medical care. David automatically assumed we'd need to step in, that family obligation would override our boundaries, but I had a different perspective. "She has insurance, Medicare, and a network of church friends who've been telling her what a victim she is," I told him. "Let them step up and provide the practical support they've been promising." It sounds harsh, perhaps, but it was not cruel. Melissa had spent years cultivating an image of herself as the wronged mother, surrounded by people who validated her grievances and condemned my selfishness. When she actually needed help, it seemed reasonable to expect that support network to provide more than just sympathy. The church ladies rallied magnificently for about 2 weeks. They brought casseroles, drove her to doctor appointments, and filled her hospital room with flowers and get-well cards. But when it became clear that Melissa's recovery would require months of ongoing assistance, help with grocery shopping, medication management, transportation to physical therapy, the enthusiasm waned considerably. Suddenly, the same people who'd been so vocal about my heartlessness began making excuses about their own obligations. They had grandchildren to babysit, health problems of their own, commitments that prevented them from providing the level of care Melissa needed. Melissa called David in tears, asking if we might reconsider our position. She didn't apologize. That would have required acknowledging that she'd done anything wrong, but she hinted that she might be willing to start fresh if we could find a way to help her through this difficult time. David looked at me with hope in his eyes, thinking perhaps this crisis could heal the family rift, but I'd learned to recognize manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Melissa can hire help with the money she's been saving on rent and utilities, I said. Or she can ask one of her sympathetic friends to provide a guest room while she recovers. But I'm not resuming the role of unpaid caregiver for someone who's never acknowledged that I'm anything more than hired help. The conversation that followed was difficult. David struggled with guilt about abandoning his mother in her time of need, and I understood his conflict. But I also understood that Melissa's crisis didn't erase years of systematic disrespect, and that stepping back into old patterns would only reinforce her belief that she could treat me badly as long as she eventually found a way to make it my problem to solve. Melissa did recover, though it took longer than it might have with family support. She hired a part-time aide, accepted help from a church volunteer program, and gradually regained her independence. The experience taught her that the people who'd been so eager to criticize my boundaries were less eager to sacrifice their own comfort to fill the gap I'd left. David and I used the crisis as an opportunity to clarify our own boundaries and values. We agreed that we'd always ensure Melissa had access to appropriate care and resources, but that we wouldn't resume the pattern of enabling her dependence or accepting her disrespect in exchange for family peace. It wasn't an easy position to maintain. Family gatherings became awkward affairs, where relatives who'd taken sides during the eviction drama struggled to navigate conversations without mentioning the elephant in the room. Some people stopped inviting us to events where Melissa would be present, choosing to avoid potential conflict rather than manage the complicated dynamics. But gradually, a new equilibrium emerged. The family members who mattered most, David's cousin Patricia, his Aunt Ruth, a few others who'd witnessed Melissa's behavior firsthand, maintained relationships with both of us while respecting the boundaries we'd established. The relatives who'd been most invested in the old family mythology, where Melissa was the benevolent matriarch and I was the ungrateful outsider, faded from our social circle. The house itself underwent a transformation that reflected our new priorities. I turned Melissa's old sewing room into a library, filling it with books on business strategy, philosophy, and biographies of women who'd overcome adversity. The formal living room where Melissa had held court for so many years became a comfortable space where David and I actually spent time, reading and talking and enjoying each other's company. I started a small herb garden in the backyard, something I'd always wanted to do but had never attempted because Melissa considered gardening common and preferred the pristine lawn that required weekly professional maintenance. The herbs supplied our kitchen and gave me a peaceful hobby that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or approval. The business continued to grow, eventually requiring a move to proper office space downtown. I kept a small home office for administrative work, but the garage conversion was transformed into an art studio, another long-suppressed interest that I finally had the freedom to pursue. David found his own path to growth and healing. He'd spent so many years managing his mother's emotions and trying to keep peace between us that he'd lost touch with his own interests and goals. Without the constant drama and mediation duties, he rediscovered his love of woodworking and started creating furniture pieces that reflected his own aesthetic rather than Melissa's traditional preferences. Our marriage, rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and direct communication, became stronger than it had ever been during the years when we'd been focused on managing family dynamics rather than nurturing our own relationship. We learned to be partners rather than co-conspirators, allies rather than fellow victims. 5 years after the eviction, we decided to sell the house on Maple Street. The decision wasn't made in anger or as a rejection of the past, but as a natural evolution toward a future that was entirely our own choice. We'd outgrown the space both literally and emotionally, and the Victorians' high maintenance requirements no longer suited our lifestyle. Melissa was furious when she learned about the sale, interpreting it as a final rejection of family history and tradition. She made several dramatic phone calls about how we were destroying David's heritage and erasing his father's memory, but her protests carried less weight than they once had. We bought a smaller house across town, a 1950s ranch with clean lines and efficient systems that required minimal maintenance. The new place had a large kitchen with windows overlooking the garden, a comfortable den where we could relax without worrying about formal entertaining, and a separate entrance to my home office that eliminated the need to apologize for conducting business in a residential space. The move felt like the final step in a journey that had begun with that Thanksgiving dinner revelation. We were no longer living in reaction to Melissa's expectations or in service to someone else's vision of what our life should look like. We were simply living our own life, making choices based on our own priorities and values. Melissa's health remained stable, though she used occasional minor ailments as opportunities to test whether we'd resume our caregiving roles. When she called to report that she'd fallen and needed someone to check on her more regularly, David offered to help her research professional monitoring services, but declined to become her on-call emergency contact. When she mentioned that her apartment was becoming difficult to manage, and perhaps she should look into assisted living, we provided information about facilities in her price range, but made it clear that she'd need to fund any care herself rather than expecting us to supplement her limited income. The boundaries we'd established weren't cruel, but they were firm. We'd learned that Melissa's needs would always expand to fill whatever space we provided, and that her demands for attention and assistance were often manufactured crises designed to restore her central role in our lives. The church community that had initially rallied around Melissa gradually learned the same lesson. Her complaints about various ailments, her hints that she needed more help than she was receiving, her suggestions that devoted children would be more involved in her care, all of these tactics became less effective as people realized that Melissa's crises often resolved themselves when no rescue was immediately forthcoming. 3 years ago, at David's 50th birthday party, Melissa made what I recognized as a final attempt to reassert her authority in our lives. She arrived at the restaurant with a gift-wrapped box and a speech prepared about how proud she was of the man David had become despite the challenges he'd faced. The speech was vintage Melissa, superficially loving but loaded with subtle criticisms of the choices we'd made and implications that David's success had occurred in spite of, rather than because of, our marriage. She presented him with a framed photo of his father and himself, taken when David was about 12, and suggested that perhaps it was time for him to reconnect with his roots and remember what really mattered in life. David accepted the gift graciously, thanked her for the thought behind it, and then set it aside to continue celebrating with the friends and colleagues we'd invited to share his milestone. He didn't give Melissa the dramatic emotional response she'd been seeking, didn't use her gift as an opportunity to reminisce about better times or express regret about family divisions. Later that evening, as we were cleaning up after the party, David looked at the framed photo and shook his head with something between sadness and amusement. "She still thinks this is all temporary, he said. Like, eventually, I'll come to my senses and realize that family loyalty should trump everything else." "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "Standing up to her, choosing our marriage over family peace?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that it took me so long," he said finally. "I regret all the years I let her treat you badly because confronting her seemed harder than asking you to endure it. I regret that I was so afraid of her disapproval that I forgot to consider whether I approved of her behavior." He set the photo in a drawer with other family mementos, not thrown away, but not given a place of honor either. "But I don't regret choosing you," he continued. "I don't regret choosing us. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living my own life instead of trying to meet someone else's expectations." That conversation stays with me as I reflect on this whole journey, because it captures something essential about what we both learned. The problem was never that Melissa was difficult or demanding. Every family has complicated personalities and challenging dynamics. The problem was that we'd accepted a system where her comfort and approval mattered more than our own dignity and happiness. Breaking free from that system required more than just legal documents and eviction notices. It required a fundamental shift in how we understood our own worth and our right to be treated with respect in our own lives. Today, as I write this story, Melissa is 82 and living in a senior community that provides the level of care and social interaction she needs. She's made friends among the residents, participates in activities, and seems to have found a measure of contentment that had eluded her during the years when she was focused on controlling David's life and resenting mine. We maintain cordial contact, holiday cards, occasional phone calls, brief visits when David feels moved to check on her welfare. The relationship is polite but distant, like acquaintances who share some common history but have little current connection. David has made peace with this limited relationship, understanding finally that his mother's love was always conditional on his compliance with her expectations. Once he stopped trying to earn approval that would always remain just out of reach, he found a different kind of peace in simply accepting Melissa as she is, rather than hoping she might change. As for me, I've learned that self-respect isn't selfish, that boundaries aren't cruel, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses. Melissa spent years treating me as less than family, and I spent years trying to prove her wrong through service and sacrifice. The freedom I found in finally accepting her assessment and responding accordingly wasn't just about housing or legal ownership. It was about recognizing my own value independently of other people's recognition, about understanding that I deserved respect not because I'd earned it through perfect behavior, but because respect is the baseline for how human beings should treat each other. The house on Maple Street was never really about the house. It was about power and control, about who had the authority to define relationships and set boundaries, about whether love could coexist with conditions and demands for subservience. In the end, Melissa taught me something valuable, though I doubt it was intentional. She taught me that approval sought from someone who's fundamentally incapable of giving it becomes a prison of your own making. She taught me that family obligation without mutual respect is just exploitation dressed up in prettier language. Most importantly, she taught me that walking away from someone else's definition of who you should be is not betrayal. It's liberation. I think sometimes about that woman who stood in the kitchen on Thanksgiving night, listening to herself being dismissed as help in her own home, and I feel deep compassion for her. She'd spent so many years trying to earn her place in a family that had already decided she didn't belong, trying to prove her worth to people who'd made it clear that her worth wasn't in question. They simply didn't care about it. But I also feel proud of her, because when the moment came to choose between continued humiliation and uncertain independence, she chose herself. It took 62 years and a very public revelation, but she finally learned that her own opinion of herself mattered more than anyone else's. The sheriff who served that eviction notice probably thought he was delivering bad news, but he was actually delivering freedom. The freedom to live without constantly monitoring someone else's mood, without apologizing for taking up space in my own life, without accepting scraps of acknowledgement in exchange for endless service. Melissa may never understand what she lost when she chose superiority over relationship, control over connection, but I understand what I gained when I finally stopped trying to change her mind and started changing my circumstances instead. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in winning someone over. It's in walking away from a game where the rules were designed to ensure you'd always lose.